7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public. Portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here at DC's Museum of the Bible, removing all obscurity and open for all to see. Dead Sea Scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls, Dead Sea region. One of the first results of this amazing research. For more than 70 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls held a mystery that no one could fully unlock. Scholars spent decades asking the same question: what do these scrolls say? But eventually someone asked a different one. What are they made of? Greater. At a laboratory at Tel Aviv University, researcher Oded Rachavi and his team examined tiny traces of ancient hidden within the dust of a single scroll fragment. When the genetic results came back, they were stunned. The DNA revealed that the animal whose skin had been used to create that scroll could not have lived anywhere near the cave, where the fragment was discovered not a year before, not even a day before. Suddenly, the story of that scroll became far more mysterious than anyone had imagined. And what that single, seemingly impossible discovery quietly revealed has the potential to change everything you thought you knew. One of the researchers held up a fragment from one of the larger scrolls. There are only a handful of these, and they are remarkably well preserved. But to understand why the DNA result was so important, you need to go back to the very beginning of the story. It starts with a shepherd and a cave. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Adib was tending his flock near the shores of the Dead Sea. At some point, he tossed a stone into a nearby cave and heard an unexpected sound, greater than the sharp crack of something breaking. Inside, curious, he climbed into the cave to investigate. Greater than. What he found would become one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Greater than. Hidden inside were ancient clay jars, and inside those jars were leather, scrolls carefully wrapped in linen, preserved for centuries in the darkness. At the time, he had no idea what he had discovered, and neither did anyone else. He was simply searching for a missing goat when he came across the entrance to a cave, hoping to scare the animal out. Picked up a stone and tossed it inside. Instead, he uncovered a secret that had been hidden for more than 2,000 years. The scrolls found in that cave would later be recognized as one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. They included the oldest known biblical manuscripts ever found, some dating back more than 2,000 years. Over the next several years, from 1947 to 1956, greater than archaeologists and explorers uncovered nearly 25,000 fragments from around 1,000 different manuscripts in 11 caves near the ancient settlement of Qumran. Among them were the earliest known copies of biblical books such as Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms, along with community records, religious hymns, legal texts, and visions of the end times. Together, these writings covered a period from roughly 250 BCE to 68 CEA, time of enormous political, religious, and social upheaval that shaped both Judaism and the beginnings of Christianity. Protected inside clay jars and preserved by the dry climate of the Judean desert, the scrolls survived, while countless empires and civilizations disappeared. They outlasted the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and nearly 20 centuries of history. Yet when scholars finally began to study and translate them, they realized the scrolls offered far more than ancient words on parchment. Instead of providing clear answers, the scrolls raised a series of mysteries that would take more than 70 years to begin unraveling. Where did these manuscripts come from? Who wrote them? Greater than. And why were they hidden away in remote desert caves? For decades, leading scholars believed they had solved the puzzle. As researchers from universities and religious institutions around the world studied the scrolls, they examined every detail they could find. They compared handwriting styles, analyzed the color and texture of the parchment, measured its thickness, and tried to determine which fragments came from the same animal skin. They also studied the language, religious beliefs, the easels, calendars, and literary traditions reflected in the texts. These manuscripts were extraordinary. They represented the oldest known copies of biblical writings ever discovered, far older than any version scholars had previously possessed. Over time, one explanation became the dominant theory. Many experts concluded that the scrolls were connected to a Jewish religious group known as the Essenes. Ancient writers such as Josephus and Pliny the Elder describe the Essenes as a disciplined community living apart from society in the Judean and desert. According to these accounts, they followed strict purity laws, devoted themselves to copying sacred texts, greater than, and believed that divine judgment would soon come upon a corrupt world. Not far from the caves stood the ancient settlement of Qumran, which seemed to match those descriptions remarkably well. The pieces appeared to fit together. Greater than. The sectarian writings found among the scrolls spoke of a close-knit religious community with its own leadership, its own rules, and even its own calendar. Unlike the official calendar used by the priesthood in Jerusalem, this group followed a solar calendar rather than a lunar one, a difference that reflected a deep religious divide. For many years, the evidence seemed convincing. The mystery appeared solved. But there was one problem. The answer was built almost entirely on what scholars could see. And hidden within their scrolls was a layer of evidence no one had ever thought to examine. The scrolls themselves seemed to support the theory. Many of the apocalyptic writings express deep hostility toward the religious authorities in Jerusalem. One of the most famous texts, known as the War Scroll, described a final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the kind of dramatic end times visions that appeared to fit perfectly with a separatist religious movement. The conclusion seemed straightforward. The Essenes lived at Qumran. They copied and preserved their sacred writings there. Then, when Roman forces swept through the region during the Jewish revolt in 68 CE, they hid their library in nearby caves to protect it from destruction. For decades, that explanation was treated as fact. It was taught in classrooms and seminaries, featured in museum exhibits, and repeated in documentaries around the world. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a library of the Essenes. Case closed. Or so everyone thought. Because this is the point where the story begins to unravel. Everything you've heard so far, the Essenes, the desert settlement, the decades-long scholarly consensus, is about to be challenged by something no one in 1947 could have imagined. The breakthrough didn't come from discovering another cave. It didn't come from uncovering a lost scroll. It began with a conversation in 2012 and a single piece of ancient cowhide that, according to everything scholars believed, should never have existed. The first signs of trouble had been there all along. Even while the Essene theory dominated academic research, difficult questions kept appearing, questions that traditional methods couldn't fully answer. The scrolls showed an astonishing variety of texts. Different versions of the same biblical books existed side by side. Manuscripts were written in different scripts and by different scribes. Some parchments were expertly prepared, while others appeared rough and almost homemade. Then came radiocarbon dating. Beginning in the early 1990s, tests on selected fragments revealed something unexpected. Some of the scrolls appeared to be older than the Qumran settlement itself. Suddenly, the timeline didn't quite fit, and there was another question that proved even more troubling. If all these manuscripts belonged to a single isolated religious community, why did they preserve multiple conflicting versions of their own sacred writings? Why would one community keep two different versions of the book of Jeremiah, one noticeably longer than the other, with entire passages missing and chapters arranged in a completely different order? For a group supposedly defined by strict religious discipline and devotion to sacred texts, it was difficult to explain. The more closely scholars looked, the more the cracks began to show. Not everyone was convinced by the traditional explanation. Over the years, some scholars suggested alternative possibilities. Maybe Qumran wasn't a religious monastery at all. Perhaps it had been a pottery workshop, a winter estate, or even a military fortress. Others proposed that the caves served as a kind of sacred storage place, where Jewish communities from different regions brought worn-out religious texts that were too holy to simply throw away. These ideas attracted interest, but none had enough hard evidence to challenge the dominant theory. Then the story took a completely unexpected turn. The breakthrough didn't come from an archaeologist digging in the desert. It didn't come from a theologian studying ancient manuscripts. It came from a geneticist having lunch. In 2012, at Tel Aviv University, molecular biologist Oded Rechavi sat down for lunch with biblical scholar Noam Mizrahi. As they talked, the conversation drifted to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the challenges that had frustrated researchers for decades. Mizrahi explained the problem. The collection contained roughly 25,000 fragments scattered across thousands of pieces. There were no titles, no page numbers, and often no reliable way to determine which fragments belonged together. The scholars had spent years relying on handwriting comparisons, parchment color, texture, and educated guesses methods that were useful, but far from perfect. The challenge was enormous. The questions were some of the most important in biblical archaeology, yet the available tools were limited. Rachavi listened carefully. Then he asked a simple question. What are the scrolls made of parchment? Mizrahi replied, animal skin. Rachavi paused for a moment. Then, the parchment contains DNA. It was a simple observation, but it changed everything. In that instant, an entirely new way of studying the Dead Sea Scrolls was born. Rachavi specialized in ancient DNA research, a field that had already transformed archaeology by helping scientists trace human migrations, identify ancient populations, and uncover details of history that traditional methods could never reveal. Now he realized the same technology might be able to answer questions that scholars had been struggling with for more than 70 years. The clues weren't hidden in the words written on the scrolls. They were hidden in the animals, whose skins had become the scrolls themselves. Rachavi immediately realized something remarkable. Scientists had been using ancient DNA to study people, animals, and entire civilizations for years, but no one had ever seriously applied the technique to ancient manuscripts. If parchment was made from animal skin, then every scroll carried a biological fingerprint of the animal it came from. That meant the scrolls themselves might hold information that had remained hidden for more than 2,000 years. Working alongside Pangina Shore, the curator responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Antiquities Authority, Rikiardi, and Mizrahi assembled a team of researchers. Together, they set out to attempt something that had never been done before. None of them could have predicted where the evidence would lead. But first, they faced a major obstacle. The Dead Sea Scrolls are among the most valuable and revered ancient texts in the world. They hold enormous significance for multiple religious traditions and are considered completely irreplaceable. That meant destructive testing was out of the question. No cutting, no drilling, no removing samples from the manuscripts. The scrolls had to remain untouched. So how do you recover genetic information from an artifact you're not allowed to damage? The answer turned out to be surprisingly simple. For decades, conservators and scholars had carefully stored the scroll fragments in protective containers. Over the years, tiny particles from the parchments naturally accumulated inside those boxes as fine dust. Most people ignored it. The researchers saw something different. That dust contained traces of collagen, the protein that gives animal skin its structure, and trapped within that collagen were tiny fragments of ancient DNA, preserved across more than 2,000 years. By collecting microscopic particles from damaged edges and blank areas where no writing appeared, the team could gather enough material for analysis without disturbing a single word of the ancient texts. The evidence had been there the entire time, quietly waiting in the dust. But finding the DNA was only the beginning. Actually extracting usable genetic information from those tiny degraded traces would prove to be an enormous challenge. Recovering DNA from the scrolls was far more difficult than anyone expected. The process of turning animal skin into parchment is extremely harsh on genetic material. The skins are soaked, scraped, stretched, and dried, all of which damage DNA at the molecular level. The iron-based inks used by ancient scribes can also be chemically corrosive. Then there was the passage of time. The scrolls had spent nearly 2,000 years in desert caves before being discovered. After that, they were handled by hundreds of researchers, conservators, and scholars over the course of more than 70 years. Every person who touched them had the potential to leave behind traces of modern DNA. To avoid contamination, the team worked in specialized ancient DNA laboratories that looked more like high-security clean rooms than research libraries. Scientists wore full protective suits. Air pressure was carefully controlled. Equipment and workspaces were sterilized with ultraviolet light. The researchers also developed strict testing procedures to prove that any DNA they recovered truly came from ancient animals, rather than modern contamination. They searched for specific patterns of molecular damage that naturally accumulate over centuries. They repeated extractions, compared results across different laboratories, and checked the data again and again. It was a slow and frustrating process. Years passed. Hundreds of samples were analyzed. Many attempts failed. But eventually, the team succeeded. They recovered reliable genetic sequences from dozens of Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Then came the moment that changed everything. When Oded Rachavi examined the results, one detail immediately stood out. Most of the fragments were exactly what researchers expected to find sheepskin. That made perfect sense. Sheep were common throughout ancient Judea, and sheepskin was the standard material used for parchment. Sheep could easily survive in the harsh environment surrounding Qumran and the Dead Sea region, but a handful of fragments produced a completely different result. They were made from cowhide. When Noam Mizrahi saw the data, he paused. He had spent years studying the scrolls, the history of Qumran, and the landscape itself. He knew the region better than most people on Earth. For a long moment, he simply stared at the results. Because cowhide parchment at Qumran wasn't merely unexpected, it seemed impossible. Qumran sits deep within the Judean desert, near the shores of the Dead Sea, one of the driest and most unforgiving environments in the region. And that was exactly the problem. The problem was simple but devastating. Qumran is located in one of the harshest and driest regions on Earth. The Judean desert receives very little rainfall, and survival there has always been difficult. Sheep and goats can live in those conditions. They are well adapted to desert life, able to survive on limited water and sparse vegetation. Cattle are different. Cows require large amounts of water every day and need substantial grazing land with plenty of grass. The environment around Qumran simply could not support herds of cattle, which meant something important. If a scroll was written on cowhide parchment, that parchment could not have been produced locally. It had to come from somewhere else. Suddenly, the traditional theory faced a serious problem. The discovery didn't merely suggest that parts of the accepted story might need revision. It showed that at least some of the scrolls had origins outside the isolated desert community scholars had long imagined. In a strange way, a single cow had exposed a flaw in a theory that had stood for decades. When the results arrived at the Israel Antiquities Authority curator, Penina Shore, immediately recognized their significance. She had spent much of her career caring for and studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. Few people knew the collection as intimately as she did. She read the findings once, then she read them again. Later, she described that moment as the point when she realized everything was about to change. Not just the debate surrounding the Essenes, but the entire framework scholars used to understand what the Dead Sea Scrolls really were. The implications were enormous, and the cowhide fragments were not random samples scattered throughout the collection. They were connected to specific texts and specific versions of particular books. That is where the story became even more surprising, because the DNA was now revealing information that no one had ever been able to see before. For the first time, researchers could use genetics to compare parchment fragments directly. By studying the DNA preserved in the animal skins, they could determine whether different fragments came from the same animal or from completely different sources. In effect, each piece of parchment carried its own biological fingerprint. If two fragments had been made from the skin of the same sheep, they would share nearly identical mitochondrial DNA. That allowed researchers to connect pieces that belonged together, and just as importantly, identify fragments that had been wrongly grouped for decades. The scrolls were no longer just ancient texts. They had become genetic evidence. For more than 70 years, scholars tried to match scroll fragments using handwriting appearance and educated guesswork. Now, for the first time, they had something far more powerful. They had genetics. They had biological fingerprints. If two fragments came from the same sheep, their DNA would be nearly identical. If they came from different animals, the genetic differences would reveal it immediately, and that is where the discoveries became truly extraordinary. Consider the book of Jeremiah. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls were two very different versions of this biblical text. One closely resembled the version found in the Hebrew Bible today, longer with chapters arranged in the familiar order. The other was noticeably shorter, with entire sections missing and chapters organized in a completely different sequence. For decades, scholars debated what this meant. Was one version an earlier draft? Had scribes edited the text over time? Were the differences simply copying mistakes that accumulated through generations? The DNA provided a new perspective. Researchers found that fragments of the shorter version were written on cow parchment, while fragments of the longer version were written on sheep parchment. The parchments came from different animals, and likely from different regions. This suggested something remarkable. These were not simply two copies of the same text tradition. They appeared to represent separate textual traditions that developed independently among different communities in ancient Judea. In other words, different groups were preserving different versions of the same biblical book. That realization changed how scholars viewed the scrolls. The evidence pointed to a world that was far more diverse and complex than previously imagined. A world in which multiple communities preserved and transmitted sacred texts in different forms. The researchers saw similar patterns elsewhere. They examined a work known as the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, a religious text describing angelic worship in the heavenly temple. Copies of this text had been discovered not only at Qumran, but also at Masada, the fortress, where Jewish rebels made their final stand against Rome in 73 CE. Genetic analysis showed that several Qumran copies were written on parchment made from entirely different animals. That finding suggested the text had been copied and circulated widely, rather than belonging exclusively to a single isolated group. The more DNA evidence emerged, the harder it became to view the Dead Sea Scrolls as the library of just one community. The scrolls appeared to be part of a much larger network of people, ideas and traditions spread across ancient Judea. And then, the researchers took the analysis even further. They began studying genetic relationships between the animals themselves. What they discovered next would reveal connections that no one had ever been able to see before. The discoveries didn't stop there. By studying nuclear DNA markers, researchers could sometimes determine whether the animals used to make different parchments were genetically related. In some cases, the evidence suggested that the animals were siblings or members of the same flock. That opened up an entirely new way of understanding the scrolls. When several fragments came from related animals, it suggested they had likely been produced in the same region and around the same time. In effect, the DNA was pointing towards specific centers where parchment was being manufactured and manuscripts were being copied. But then another pattern emerged. Groups of genetically related parchments appeared alongside fragments that had no biological connection whatsoever. Some came from entirely different animals, different flocks, and likely different regions. There was no shared genetic origin. The implications were profound. The collection did not appear to have grown out of a single workshop or a single community producing manuscripts in one location. Instead, the evidence suggested that the scrolls had been gathered from multiple sources, representing different communities, different traditions, and different periods of time. What had once looked like a single library now looked more like a collection, assembled from many places. At that point, the traditional Essene library theory didn't merely develop a few weaknesses. Its foundation began to give way. A new picture of the ancient world was emerging, one filled with many voices, not just one. The DNA suggests the Dead Sea Scrolls may have come from multiple Jewish communities across Judea, not a single isolated sect. The caves near Qumran may have served as a sacred storage place, where important texts were preserved rather than discarded. If so, the scrolls are not the library of one group, but a collection of many traditions, beliefs, and versions of scripture gathered in one place. The cowhide fragments prove that some texts traveled from distant regions into the Judean desert, revealing a connected network of communities sharing ideas and sacred writings. For biblical scholars, the implications are profound. Different communities preserve different versions of books like Jeremiah, Genesis, and Psalms, showing that the biblical canon was still taking shape. The DNA confirms that the world of Jesus was one of vibrant religious debate, diverse interpretations, and competing visions of faith, a world reflected in the scrolls themselves. Most remarkably, the evidence had been hidden in plain sight for decades in microscopic traces of dust. By studying DNA preserved in the animal skins of the scrolls, researchers uncovered a story no one expected. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not simply the library of one isolated sect. They were the voices of many communities, carrying different traditions, beliefs, and versions of scripture. For generations, scholars focused on the ink. The breakthrough came when scientists learned to read the skin beneath it. In 1947, a shepherd's stone opened the cave. In 2020, DNA revealed what those scrolls had been waiting more than 2,000 years to tell us. And the story is far from over. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are countless mysteries hidden in history, and we're just beginning to uncover them.